Hello, everyone. So good to be with you today, even if it's just like this through the camera. It's good to stay in touch during this time that we're all sheltering indoors. I want to welcome all of the members of First Baptist Church as well as Filipino Community Church, Iglesia Remanente, and family and friends from all over who are watching today. During the week, as the week began, I was actually working on another sermon than what I'm going to do right now. I was working on a sermon from the life of Moses that I'm going to do next Sunday. But I think it was Tuesday morning. I was just reading through the Gospels as I normally do each day. And I came across a little passage that really spoke to me. And I kept thinking about it and thinking about it. And I'd go back and sit down and read it again and started to make a few notes on the computer, on a Word document, and kept making more and more notes, and eventually it started to make its way into a sermon. I'm going to share that with you today. Let me read the passage. First of all, this is from Matthew chapter 13. I'm going to read verses 44 through 46. Just 3 verses, but these are 2 separate parables about the kingdom of heaven. Listen to what Jesus says. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in the field, which a man found and hid again. And from joy over it, he goes and sells all that he has and buys the field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant seeking fine pearls. And upon finding one pearl of great value, he went and sold all that he had and bought it. I suppose one reason the parables spoke to me so much is everybody likes a story about hidden treasure. A couple of years ago, my wife and son and I took a cruise to Alaska, and we fell in love with the place. It's just beautiful. One of the things we did while we were there, one of the excursions, was we got on the train. I don't remember the name of the town where it goes from, but it was kind of the base for people who were going up into the Yukon in the late 1890s to explore for gold. Now, the train doesn't go that far anymore, but we took it part of the way. And while you're on the train, the conductor tells you the story of the great gold rush in the Klondike region of the Yukon in the late 1890s. It began in 1896 when some local miners discovered gold there. And once the news reached the lower 48 states, the gold rush was on. And in the next 3 years that followed, over 100,000 men moved to that area in search of gold. Some became rich, most didn't. When we came back home, I started doing some study on my own, just reading about that particular time. And I remember reading about one man who sold everything he had to go there to buy the equipment he would need for prospecting. And he went to the Klondike and he bought his food and bought a horse and all of that he would need to go up there to pan for gold. And he stayed there for months and did not find a single ounce of gold. Eventually, when all of his food had run out and all of his resources were gone, he decided to head for home. And so, dejected, he prepared for the long journey home on foot. And he started walking. And he walked and he walked, and eventually a rainstorm settled in over Alaska, and it rained like he had never seen rain before. It rained for days on end, unrelenting, without stopping. And he cursed his fate that he had given up everything to come here to find gold and couldn't find anything, and now he was subjected to this torrential rainstorm. But as he was walking alongside of a mountain, he looked up ahead and noticed on the road a giant nugget of gold. The rain had dislodged it from the mountain, and it had rolled there and was waiting on the road for him to find it and to pick it up. These parables that Jesus read are something like that. They are about two men finding a treasure of enormous value. And Jesus says that these two parables are like the kingdom of heaven. Now, I told you one of the reasons the story appealed to me and why I couldn't stop thinking about it was it's a treasure hunt in a sense. But the other was more profound, I suppose, a deeper interest. When you read these two short parables and Jesus says, this is what the kingdom of heaven is like, if you're honest, you probably had the reaction that I had when I read it. And my question was, like what? Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is like this, but what? It's not apparent when you first read it. Now, Matthew uses the term kingdom of heaven. Matthew was writing to Jewish readers, and out of deference to their sensitivities about saying the name of God out loud, he uses the phrase kingdom of heaven. Mark, Luke, and John all use the term kingdom of God. They mean the same thing. The two terms are interchangeable. So what does it mean? If Jesus said these two parables tell us what the kingdom of heaven, like what is the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God? I jotted down this definition. Scripture envisions the world as a divine kingdom over which God rules as king. You might recall that in the Lord's Prayer, Jesus envisions earth as a society where the will of God is done just as it is done in heaven. But in a simpler sense, in a less theological sense, the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of heaven, is wherever Jesus is Lord. To become his disciple is to become part of the kingdom. And these parables were directed to the disciples. You find that later on in the chapter, in verse 51 of this chapter, when Jesus pulls the disciples aside and he wants to make sure that even though most of the people there were confused by what he had said, he wanted to make sure that they understood them, and he asked them to make sure they got the message. The kingdom of heaven is wherever Jesus is Lord. So let's look a little more closely at the two parables here. In verse 44, we find the parable of the hidden treasure. It's just one verse. The Bible tells us of a man who is working out in a field. It's a field he didn't own. He may have leased the field, but it's more likely that he was a day laborer. He had gone out in that field, was paid not even an hourly wage, he was paid a wage for the day. He had a job to do, and no matter how many hours it took him to do it, he was going to earn that little bit of pay for that day. This was a man who was accustomed to working long, difficult hours out in the hot sun. I think about my dad when I read this parable. For those of you who didn't know my dad, he grew up on a farm. So all of his childhood he worked outdoors. And then when he was old enough to get a job off of the farm, he did construction work, and he drove heavy equipment like bulldozers. Did that until he was 70 years old, worked his entire life out in the hot sun. And if you knew my dad, you know, saying that he had a tan, that doesn't describe what my dad looked like. He was dark, dark, dark. And I picture this man in this parable like that. He would have been a man who was dark, accustomed to spending all day, every day, out in the hot sun, doing backbreaking labor. But while he's out there digging, he uncovers a hidden treasure. Now, that may sound strange to us. We are not accustomed to finding treasure in the ground, but back then it was not uncommon. There were no banks or credit unions or savings and loans back then. People kept their treasures, whatever they had, coins, whatever, they kept them indoors. But this little plot of ground that we know today as Israel or Palestine, This had been the site of battles for over 1,000 years. And when war came, your valuables weren't safe indoors, and so people would go out into the fields and bury their treasure underground until it was safe to dig them back out. Sometimes the people in a certain area might have been taken captive or worse, and the treasure that they had hidden in the ground remained hidden until someone stumbled upon it, like the man in our parable today. When he finds the treasure, he quickly buries it again so that he can go home and sell all that he has to buy it again. And if you're thinking that it might have been a little shady what he's doing, you should know that rabbinic law of the day was that anything that was found belonged to the finder. It didn't matter whose property it was on. Our laws are different today in America, but there, in that time, if you found something, you owned it according to rabbinic law, or at least you had the right to get it. And so this man, he goes home and he gathers together whatever he has to sell. You can imagine it wasn't much. Maybe a piece of furniture, an extra garment. But he gathers together what little he has, because he has found something that is worth all that he has and more. He's not sacrificing to do it. There's no mention of sacrifice. On the contrary, the verse says that he does it out of great joy, because what he has found is worth more than everything he has. Now the second parable, the parable of the costly pearl. The man in this story is different than the first man. He's not a day laborer. He owns his own business. He's not poor. He's well off. In fact, he travels around the area trading in pearls. Probably he had traveled to the Persian Gulf. That's where the finest pearls were found in that area of the world during that time. You can picture this if you use your imagination a little bit. He goes to that area of the world and he's going to visit a pearl sheik. Just as there are oil sheiks today, there were pearl sheiks back then. And you can see this man as he arrives on the scene and exchanges pleasantries with one of the employees of the pearl sheik. Maybe they shared some coffee together. But then the man, the businessman, he's taken into the tent of the pearl sheik. And he goes in and he sits down. It's understood that he's there to do business. The pearl sheik would have shown him what he had for sale that day. And then he would have reached into his tunic perhaps and pulled out a pouch. And as he opened it, he would pour that pearl onto the ground. And the pearl merchant, the businessman, he sees it. And it's the most exquisite, perfect pearl he has ever seen. And he knows immediately that he will do whatever he has to do to possess that pearl. And he sells all that he has so that he might find it. Now there are differences in the two parables. One man is not searching for anything of great wealth. He just comes upon it by chance. The other man is seeking it. But the point is the same. Both men found a great treasure. And the question that the two parables ask of us today is, now that the greatest treasure has been found, what will the person do? A decision is required. All of the parables of Jesus at their essence are parables of decision. Someone has called them parables of crisis. In them, as in these two parables, an individual is presented with a choice, and he must decide what to do. No parable ever begins with the words, "The kingdom of heaven is like a man sitting on his porch in a rocking chair." The parables are about decision. Now that the crisis has been presented, what will you do? These two parables are calling upon us to make a decision. And the decision is whether or not we will let anything stand in the way of knowing Jesus Christ and being his disciple. To know Christ, to be his disciple, is the greatest treasure on earth, worth more than any other treasure. The Apostle Paul knew that. That's why he wrote in the 3rd chapter of the Epistle to the Philippians, "What things were gain to me, I counted as loss, that I might gain Christ." Nothing is of greater value. Guy de Maupassant was a French writer in the 1800s. He wrote a short story called The Necklace. The story begins with a young couple. The young wife's name is Matilda. She longs to be an aristocrat, even though she has been born into a family of low means. Her husband, Loisel, is a clerk. Makes low wages, but he does everything he can to make his wife happy. One day, unexpectedly, they receive an invitation to a ball. All of the upper crust will be invited. It's being sponsored by the French Ministry of Education. Somehow they have received an invitation. But Matilda doesn't want to go. She doesn't have anything to wear. Her husband tells her she's beautiful no matter what she wears, but she is determined she cannot go in the simple clothing that she has. So her husband, Loisel, takes the money that he has saved up, and he buys a beautiful gown for her to wear. She tries it on and she loves the dress, but she tells him she still can't go because she's so unadorned. She has nothing to wear with the gown. He suggests to her that he cut her some fresh flowers and she wear that in her hair. But she says no, she could only go if she had beautiful jewelry to wear. He doesn't have money to buy jewelry. But as they think about it, they remember that they know a very wealthy woman. A woman named Madame Forestier. And she has the most beautiful diamond necklace that anyone has ever seen. And so Matilda goes to her house and explains to her her situation and asks if she can borrow the necklace. And to her amazement, Madame Forestier tells her that she can, and she loans her the necklace. And Matilda and Loisel, they go to the ball. They dance all of the dances. They have a wonderful time. Everyone comments on how beautiful Matilda's necklace is. When the ball is over, they go home and they are remembering this most perfect evening. When Matilda realizes that she no longer has the necklace around her neck. She's lost it and she has no idea where it is. She retraces her steps, but it's gone. They were good people, honest people. And they knew the only right thing was to replace the necklace with one of equal value, but they could never afford that. They went to the best jewelry shop in the city the next day and they found a beautiful diamond necklace that looked just like the one she had borrowed from Madame Forestier. And it cost $40,000. Loisel had an inheritance from his father that he was going to receive when his father died that was worth about half of that. And so he asked his father to give him that money now, which his father did. For the remaining half, they took out high interest loans here and there to make up the other $20,000. And they bought the necklace. And the next day, Matilda went to the home of Madame Forestier and returned it to her without comment, just gave it to her and thanked her and went on her way. For the next 10 years, Matilda and Loisel lived in utter poverty, trying to pay off those loans. They worked 2 jobs. They left their house and moved into a cheap apartment where they had to climb steep stairs to the top of the building every day. But in 10 years, they paid it off. It took a great toll on them physically. One day, after the 10 years, by chance, Matilda ran into Madame Forestier in one of the city streets and she spoke to her. Madame Forestier didn't recognize her. Matilda was dressed in tattered clothing, and she had aged incredibly since she had seen Matilda last. And she commented to her and asked, "What has happened?" And Matilda came clean. She told her what had happened, that she had borrowed the necklace and had lost it. And that they had taken everything they had, borrowed against their future, to buy a necklace that looked like the one they had borrowed and return it to her. And when she told her that story, Madame Forestier shrieked and said, "You fool. No one loans their real jewels. The necklace I loaned you was paste." Matilda and Loisel had devoted their lives to something that was of no value. That is the heart of these 2 parables that we read today. Jesus is saying to us that it is possible to spend your life on things that are of no value. And he calls upon us today to decide, now that we have been presented with the choice, what will we decide? Will we live our lives for things that are of no value? Or will we devote our lives to Christ, to be his disciples in his kingdom, which is the greatest treasure of all? That is the decision that you must make today. Will you decide, if you haven't done so already, to commit your life to Jesus Christ, to be his disciple in his kingdom? You can do it right where you are, to just say, Jesus, I commit myself to you as your disciple in your kingdom. Would you do that today? Looking forward to being with you again next Sunday. Until then, may God bless and keep you every day.